She was the quiet librarian, so timid she barely spoke above a whisper in a crowd. Yet when she sang, her voice stirred tears from a millionaire who had once vanished from the limelight, trying to outrun his own pain. He had lost everything. After his sister died, now every week he sat alone in the darkest corner of the library just to hear her sing, as if her voice had been carried from the past. But she wasn't singing for him. Her song was for the father who had worked himself to death. A small voice, a shattered soul. Two strangers meeting at just the right moment, saving each other without ever needing names. There are cities that carry a quiet kind of sorrow, even without saying a word. Portland in early autumn is one of them. Yellow light spills from shop windows. Rain clings to the sidewalks. The streets feel like they know how to keep a secret, as if you could disappear into them and no one would ask you why. Julian West had once lived under the stage lights. His name graced the covers of elite tech magazines. The man who sold his AI education app for $300 million, one of America's top tech millionaires under 35. The brother of the digital mind. He used to step onto stages, as if onto a moving walkway, speak to 200 people behind glass walls, sign the backs of books, pose with investors, give interviews with eyes alert and a practiced smile. But after Lucy, his only sister, the closest person in his life, died, all that meaning drained away, a sudden accident. One last message, a missed call. A familiar face behind glass, then a hollow house waiting when he returned. After the funeral, Julian vanished. No press, no appearances, not even a post. He turned down every invitation, sold off nearly all his shares, and let his Manhattan penthouse become a darkened bedroom. A whole year passed like a blank page. The people who once called him a pioneer began to call him a mystery. And tonight, for the first time in 12 months, Julian stepped out, not to return, but to disappear again. Orion's Cup. Open mic night. Tonight. A message. From the only old friend he still kept in touch with. Not an invitation, just a sentence that read like a breadcrumb. No need to talk. It's quiet there. Music's actually good. Julian wasn't sure what he was looking for. He just knew that if he spent another night in that apartment, he'd lie awake until dawn, his heartbeat a wave crashing against the past. Wrapped in a long wool coat, cap pulled low, he pushed the cafe door open with a hand that trembled. From cold, or something deeper, the doorbell chimed. Warmth wrapped around him, wood and old paper, espresso in the air, low voices of regulars murmuring nearby. A ceiling light cast a gentle amber glow. A small stage of pine, barely big enough for a person and a piano. Julian took the table in the corner. No one recognized him and no one looked twice. He ordered an Americano, black, and nodded his thanks in silence when it arrived. His mind looped through the same reel. Lucy practicing chords on the couch, strings faint and soft. Her half laughs. The message she sent that last day. Come home early next time, okay? I want to sing the new one for you. There was no next time. He gripped the edge of his chair. A sharp ache bloomed in his chest, but the tears didn't come. On stage, a young couple sang an old love song. The girl smiled when she forgot the lyrics. The cafe clapped. Julian barely noticed. He checked his watch, started to rise. Then the MC's voice rang out. Next up is Lata's her first time performing, so let's be gentle with her. He didn't know why he stayed seated. A young woman stepped onto the stage, petite, an oversized sweater, dark brown hair tied low, no makeup. She bowed her head and walked slowly to the mic. I'm sorry if my voice is a little quiet, she said. Her soft ripple of laughter, gentle, affectionate. She sat at the piano. Her thin fingers touched the keys. Then she sang. No climax, no flourish, no need to impress, just a song soft as breath. If I don't speak loud, will someone still hear me? Julian looked up. He couldn't remember the last time his heart beat that clearly. That voice, unadorned, even trembling, carried something deeper. Not melody, but a whisper from someone who had lived too long in the dark and was now trying just once to step into the light. The cafe held its breath. Even the phones were lowered, as if everyone knew This moment shouldn't be interrupted. Julian looked at the girl, Lena, and saw a glimpse of Lucy in her, not in her face but in her eyes, quiet but not fragile, sad but not broken. The way Lucy used to look at him when she wanted him to stop, look at her, and really listen. And now he was listening. For the first time in so long. When the song ended, no one spoke. Then someone clapped, and then another. Then the whole room. Lena bowed deeply and stepped down quickly. Julian remained in his seat. His coffee had gone cold. But something inside him wasn't empty anymore. He didn't know her name, but he knew. He would come back. Not for the song, not for the cafe, but for that voice. The voice that had gently knocked on a door within him. The door Lucy once held. The key to... Lena hesitated until the very last moment. The sign-up sheet was just a crumpled A4 paper on the bar counter. The words, "Open Mic Night, every Wednesday," scrawled in blue marker, a few names scribbled underneath in hurried handwriting. She watched it from across the room for 10 full minutes, seated in her usual corner, notebook in hand, the same one that held all the lyrics she had ever written for herself. She worked at the East Side Public Library, earned just enough to get by her schedule, a quiet rhythm of predictability. She shared a small apartment with an old college friend, kept a cat named Murphy, and wrote songs every night after work, like a private ritual of healing. No one in her life had ever truly heard her sing, not because she kept it hidden, but because she never thought anyone would want to hear. Tonight, after months of sitting quietly and listening to others perform, she had brought a single sheet of music, the song she'd written on a rainy night after her father's memorial. It was less a performance than a confession, hushed and without crescendo, a small wish. If I speak in a whisper, will someone hear? And when her name, Lena, was called, something inside her froze. For one brief second she couldn't move, but then something pushed her, an unnamed force, maybe just the quiet fear of disappearing completely. So she stood. Julian didn't see her at first. He was still turning his coffee cup slowly, head bowed, mind drifting through the residue of his own silence, until he heard it. "I'm sorry if my voice is a little quiet." The words touched something in him, a voice not asking to be noticed, but one you instinctively wanted to listen to. He looked up. For the first time that night, his gaze locked on the stage and didn't look away. Lena sat on the worn wooden stool beside the upright piano. Her hands trembled slightly as they found the keys. But when she pressed the first note, the E sound was clear, unembellished, like something that had lived inside her for a long time. Then she began to sing. "If I don't speak loud, will someone still hear me?" No one spoke, no clinking of glasses, no chairs scraping. The room, though no one knew her name, had never seen her before, was held in place by that single question. Julian felt himself exposed, as if the song had peeled him open. The words felt like they'd been written from within him, from the night he sat at Lucy's bedside, holding her cold hand, unable to say anything. From every keynote speech he'd recited with conviction, but never quite believed, Lena's voice wasn't powerful. It wasn't perfect, but there was something in it that made you want to protect her. A truth that didn't ask to be admired, a kind of beauty that asked for nothing. For Lena, every lyric was a step across a tightrope between two worlds. The world where she had grown used to hiding, and the one where she dared, just briefly, to lift her head and meet someone's gaze. And at the back of the room, in the quietest corner, Julian was doing just that. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she was from, but in her eyes he saw something he recognized, the look of someone who had lost too much to still believe in hope, yet still wanted to try, just once. When the song ended, Lena remained still. No one clapped right away. Not because they didn't like it, but because no one wanted to break what they had just felt. Then one person clapped, then another, and slowly the whole room lit up. Lena smiled faintly, bowed low, and stepped down from the stage without ever lifting her eyes to the crowd. Julian stayed where he was, his coffee long cold. But for the first time in a year he had truly heard something, Not with his ears, but with the part of him that had gone silent the day Lucy left, and he knew he would come back. He didn't know why, only that something had shifted tonight, soft as breath, but unforgettable. There are people whose names we never learn, yet their presence begins to seep into the rhythm of our lives like a familiar melody, not loud, not insistent, simply there, quiet, but undeniable. Julian returned to Orion's Cup the Wednesday, following Lena's first performance. He came earlier this time, not out of eagerness, but because something within him had urged him to leave his dim apartment sooner than usual. Same thick coat, same low-drawn cap, same smudged sunglasses. But when he stepped through the cafe's wooden door, he sensed something different in the air, or maybe it was simply that he had changed. He took the same seat, tucked behind the wide pillar, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the stage while keeping him cloaked in shadow. The girl Lena hadn't appeared yet. Still, Julian sat quietly. An Americano was set down in front of him without being ordered. Perhaps the staff had already learned his rhythm. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Only that inside he felt as still as a lake after rain. But just beneath the surface, something had begun to stir. The night unfolded. A few voices rose and fell. A man strummed a Billie Eilish cover on a ukulele. A college student recited spoken word. Each act passed like brushstrokes in a painting, colorful but without center, until the MC stepped forward again, mic in hand. And now, someone I'm sure you all remember, Lena. Her name landed like a soft touch. Julian looked up, not out of curiosity this time, but out of need. Lena stepped on stage, still slight, still with her low-tied brown hair, still avoiding every gaze. But there was something different. In her tonight, not confidence exactly, but a quiet ease, as if she'd stopped needing to hide. This song, I wrote it not long ago, she said, voice light as mist. It's about someone who doesn't know they're being heard. A simple introduction like so many others. But Julian felt a sharp pang in his chest. She placed her fingers on the keys, no searching for chords. She knew them intimately. The piano notes rose unadorned like memories given shape through sound, and then she sang, no preamble, no pretense. You sit in shadows, but I feel you near the quiet. Beats louder than voices here. Julian didn't blink. The words slipped beneath his layers, brushed against the places not yet healed. He wondered, did she know he was here? Was she singing to him? No one else in the cafe could have known. But something in the room shifted, as if instinctively everyone fell silent, as though space itself had cleared to make room for something sacred. Lena didn't look at anyone. But every time her eyes drifted, Julian felt unmasked. He clenched his fingers around the cold ceramic cup, not out of fear she might see him, but because he didn't know what he'd do if she truly did. She ended the song with no lyrics, just a scattering of quiet notes, soft as breath, like all the things we never say aloud. And then stillness, no immediate applause, as though the room was waiting for its heartbeat to return. Then someone clapped, not loud, not fast, just enough. And then others joined one by one. The room didn't erupt. It resonated. Lena bowed, then stepped down. As she passed the bar, her gaze paused, just 1 second, in Julian's direction. Only a second, but enough. Enough for him to know, and she knew. That night, he didn't write, didn't play, but he didn't sleep either. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank page, and for the first time in many months, he asked himself, if I wrote, not for the public, not for a startup, not to impress, but simply to say something true, what would I say? Across the city, Lena couldn't sleep either. She watched the open window, listened to the hush of wind, and thought about the man in the corner, the one who never spoke, but always listened with his eyes. She didn't know his name, but she knew this. Because of him, she was singing differently now, and that was enough. Not every night leaves a trace. Some performances pass like wind, soft, fleeting, gone before you notice. But then there are nights like that one, nights when Lena stepped off stage with a quiet certainty. Someone had heard her, not just with ears but with something deeper. She left the stage and walked toward the bar for her usual glass of water. As her eyes skimmed over the crowd, she noticed an empty seat, the seat where the quiet stranger usually sat. Empty. The coffee cup remained. The chair still bore the warmth of someone who had just left. She blinked, about to turn away, when something caught her eye, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the still warm cup. Her heart skipped, not from curiosity, but from a feeling too fragile to name. Like stepping into a familiar room and realizing someone had just been there and just left, Lena walked over, gently lifted the note. One sentence, handwritten. "You sing like my sister did." No name, nothing else. Just one line, like it had been written in a breath held too long. She looked up. At that exact moment, the cafe door creaked open. The man in the wool coat, hat low, turned back just once, as if to take a final look. The light from the street lamp caught his face, half in shadow, half revealed. Their eyes met. Only for a second. No words, no gestures. But something. In Lena stirred awake, a memory she'd never had but somehow knew, as if she'd seen that look before, in a dream she'd long since forgotten. Julian stood there, for the first time, not hiding, not retreating. And then, without a sound, he turned and vanished into Portland's dark streets like a figure uncertain if he was real. That night, Lena held the note long after she'd memorized it. She didn't read it again. She didn't have to. But she kept her fingers wrapped around it, afraid that if she let go, the feeling might dissolve too. The next day, she wrote a letter, short, unsent. She wrote about the song she'd sung the night before, the one she'd written on a sleepless night, thinking of her father, who had worked himself into silence to keep her safe. She didn't use capital letter. She didn't use punctuation. She wrote as if whispering into someone's ear. She folded the letter, slipped it into her coat, and returned to the cafe late the next afternoon. She left it beneath the same cup, now untouched by anyone else, and the next day when she came back, the letter was gone. In its place, another note, in the same careful hand. "I once left the stage because I couldn't bear the applause of people who didn't understand me. Last night I sat in the crowd and thought, if only my sister were still alive." Lena read it, and this time the tears came without warning. Not loud, but something inside her cracked wide open. From then on, every week she left a letter. And every week there was one waiting for her. They didn't text, they didn't email, they never asked names. Only the letters, sometimes long, sometimes just a line, tucked quietly into a world no one else could touch. Julian's words never spoke of companies, success, or money. They were fragments of memory, about a sister who once begged to learn the ukulele, about dinners missed and never made up, about the last time he walked out the door not knowing it would be the final time he saw her smile. Lena didn't ask questions. She simply replied, with remembered sounds, a melody her father once hummed, a rainy afternoon when she longed for someone to tell her her voice mattered. Little by little, the letters wove something formless, not love, not yet trust, but something that was no longer unfamiliar, just two people from two very different worlds, trying to fill the quiet space inside them, with a language made not of sound, but of all that was lost, unsaid, and slowly being found again on the chain. Certain nights when Julian sat at Lucy's old piano, he wondered, was he bringing her back just a little, through these nameless exchanges? And Lena, unfolding each new letter, always smiled softly, because even if she never saw him again, she knew one thing with quiet certainty. She was no longer singing alone. The first letters between them were like wordless melodies, silent yet echoing far. No introductions, no formal beginning, but neither of them ever spoke of ending. Each line was something that couldn't be said aloud, a piece of themselves, long buried beneath layers of achievement, caution, and loss. Lena didn't write back immediately after receiving Julian's letter. But she kept it in her coat pocket all day, like a drop of ink still wet on her heart. The last line haunted her through the night. If only my sister were still alive. The next morning she sat at her tiny kitchen table, Murphy curled in her lap, purring softly. She picked up a blue gel pen and a sheet of plain notebook paper, no pattern, no logo. She began writing without editing, without crossing anything out. She wrote about her father. He never sang, but every night he played music so I could fall asleep. He held my hands to teach me the A minor chord, though his fingers were calloused and cracked. He worked 2 jobs, and whenever I asked if he was tired, he'd say, "Not as tired as I'd be if I couldn't take care of you." She didn't call Julian by name, didn't sign her own, but her tone, unpolished, tender, like whispering to someone she'd known forever, felt as if she'd already known him, despite having only met his eyes once. That afternoon, she folded the letter and slipped it. Beneath the familiar coffee cup, no one asked. No one stopped her. It was a small gesture, but one anchored by a fragile belief that when something is written with truth, it will find the one meant to read it. Later that night, when the cafe had emptied out, Julian returned. He took the letter, but didn't read it there. He walked home, sat beside Lucy's old piano and read it slowly, one line at a time, as though listening to a song written just for him. His chest tightened at the part about Lena's father's hands, and suddenly his own father came to mind, the quiet man who never asked Julian what he needed, but always waited for him to come home for the holidays, who took time off work to attend every one of Lucy's recitals, even if he didn't understand the music. The next day, Julian wrote, "Back, my father once bought Lucy a tiny piano when she was 6. I laughed, said she'd quit, but she didn't. I remember how she played her first song, wrong notes everywhere, but her eyes lit up like stars. I never learned music, but I remember the sound of those keys and her laughter, filling the living room." The letters that followed were never long. They didn't try to tell whole stories, just fragments, slivers of memory, pieces of sound, moments stirred by a melody or a rainy night. Once Lena wrote, "I used to think no one would remember me if I disappeared, but through music, I feel like I've left a trace." Julian replied, "I used to fear being forgotten even while on magazine covers, but now I see what stays with people isn't the spotlight, it's what you leave behind, quietly." And so, week after week, the letters became their own quiet rhythm, not rushed, not clearly defined, but something both of them waited for. Lena found her singing beginning to change, softer, truer, as if every note was part of a long, unfinished conversation. Julian each night sat beside the piano Lucy once played. He pressed simple chords, not to practice, but because he needed the sound to keep the emptiness away, and slowly, the vague feeling between them began to take shape. A connection. Not love, not quite trust, but something unmistakable, like 2 notes in harmony that had never met, but fit together perfectly. They had never held hands, never spoken aloud, but in those letters they had touched each other, at their most honest, their most hidden core, and neither of them realized it yet, but they were already writing something more beautiful than any love song. A connection, born not from what is said, but from all the things that were never said at all. A soft rain was falling over Portland the afternoon Lena found the letter, folded neatly, slipped beneath the familiar coffee cup, just like always. But this time, it was different, heavier. Inside wasn't just a note, but a photograph, worn, faded, taken on film. The shot was angled slightly, a young girl sitting at a piano, her hair tied off center, slender fingers resting on the keys, eyes tilted toward the person behind the lens. On the back, a single line, "Lucy, my sister." Smiling like the whole world was listening. The letter that came with it wasn't long, no embellishment, no explanation, just fragments, like breaths released after holding in memory for too long. "I used to live by running. From fame, from success. Everything I built was a way to outrun the emptiness I couldn't face," Lucy once told me. Music is how she kept the things she couldn't say. I lived to forget. You. You sing to remember. Lena read slowly, her fingers trembling as she turned the photo over. She stared at it for a long time, memorizing a face she'd never seen before, yet somehow felt as familiar as blood. She brought the picture home, set it gently on her bookshelf, beside the only photo she had of her father. And something. Inside her quietly bridged the two names, Lucy and him. That night she didn't write a reply. She walked. No bag, no umbrella. Just a thick coat and the sound of a wordless piano piece she'd played at her very first open mic, playing softly in her headphones. Her footsteps moved to the rhythm of rain, her thoughts trailing behind her like chords unfinished. Later, back home, she sat at her desk and searched a name she never thought would be tethered to her life. Julian West. One search. Hundreds of results. Tech millionaire. Founder of an education AI that redefined classrooms. Cover of Forbes. And then, vanished after the sudden death of his younger sister, Lucy West, 22. She didn't feel overwhelmed, just still. Like someone had placed a life into her hands and asked her quietly, "Now what will you write?" Lena wrote the next morning. Blue ink, blank page, slanted script like wind slipping through curtain slats. "I know who you are now. And strangely, that makes you feel no farther from me. I used to think that if I ever stood beside someone successful, I'd feel too small to speak. But now I see, pain doesn't care about wealth. There are voids that only music and honesty can reach, but I don't need you to be successful. I just want you to be real." She placed the letter on the table, same spot as always. But this time, before leaving, she turned back, not to glance at the stage, but at the shadowed corner where the quiet man had sat for so many weeks. He wasn't there that night. No reply came the next day. But 3 days later, when she walked in again, there it was. A handwritten sheet of music, edges smudged, ink bleeding slightly at the corners. No words, just notes. A piano melody with a title penciled faintly at the top. A song no one will hear, but still had to be written. Lena looked down and her eyes shimmered, not with sorrow but with knowing. This wasn't the story of a man who had once been famous, or of a girl who feared being invisible. This was something else. Two people who had dared to strip away their final layer and let themselves be seen, fully, truthfully, not through accomplishments, but through music and the quiet courage it takes to step out from silence. Some things can't be written in letters, some memories don't fit within lines of blue ink, and some moments, wordless as they are, resound like a song that has waited years to be heard. Julian understood this one quiet, rainy afternoon, seated at Lucy's old piano, his hands resting on the worn black and white keys as if they'd grown up with every scratch. He wrote one more letter, but this time not for the cafe. He wrote it for himself, then tucked it into his coat pocket. Lucy once played a song she wrote herself. She called it "The Song Without Applause." She said, "There are things I can only say when no one's listening." The night she died, I was at a press conference. She sent me her final recording, but I didn't open it. The first night I heard you sing, Lena, you made me listen to it for the first time. And you know what? The song you wrote, it was eerily similar. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe you, somehow, are the voice Lucy left behind. It was the last letter Julian ever wrote, not because there was nothing left to say, but because it was time to listen. That week, when Lena stepped onto the stage, she wasn't expecting anything. Just another quiet Wednesday night. There was no letter waiting, no handwritten sheet music, no sign he had been there. But she didn't feel disappointed. She knew if he had something to say, he'd find his way to say it. She sat down and adjusted the microphone. I wrote this for someone who used to sing when no one listened, but tonight, I hope someone does. The first notes fell like breath. She didn't look at the crowd. She closed her eyes and let the melody carry her, and halfway through, when she opened them, her voice caught for a beat. He was there. Julian sat in the front row, not in the shadows, not behind a pillar. For the first time, he wasn't hiding, no hat, no sunglasses, Just his face lit softly by the glow of the overhead stage lights, calm and open. No one else in the cafe knew. But Lena did. And in that single moment, she knew she wasn't singing alone. Julian wasn't hearing the song with his ears. He was hearing it with his heart. Each note, each lyric, was a thread pulling him out of the dark corners of memory, out of the rooms he'd locked away his grief in, out of the silence he'd mistaken for safety. Lena's song had no climax. It was, like Lucy's had been, a long whisper, meant for no applause, only to be truly heard. When the song ended, no one moved. Julian sat perfectly still, as if even breathing too hard would shatter the moment. Lena bowed. When she looked up, their eyes met again. No words, no gestures, just a look, gentle, honest, and full of understanding. She didn't need to ask. He didn't need to explain. Everything had already been said, in letters, in songs, and in the silence between them that held all the things words couldn't carry. After the performance, Julian didn't stay. He slipped out before anyone noticed. But when Lena returned, to that familiar corner table, she saw something. No letter, no page, just a small silver USB placed with care. Etched on its surface were the words, "The Song Without Applause, Lucy West." She held it in her hands as if holding someone else's soul, and she understood. Sometimes listening doesn't ask for a reply. Sometimes the most healing thing is simply knowing you're no longer speaking into silence. She and he, both of them, had once believed they were quietly alone. But tonight they knew. There is a kind of sound that needs no name, no ovation, and once it's heard, it never fades. Not all pain needs to be unraveled with words. Some truths, held quietly, echo farther than any cry. Lena woke earlier than usual. Morning light spilled through her window, casting a soft glow across the photo of her father on the bookshelf, an old snapshot from a parent-teacher meeting where he stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Since the night Julian gave her the USB, Lucy's final song, something in Lena had stirred. Not sorrow, a quiet urgency. She played the recording. No lyrics. Just piano. Hesitant, tender, layered with meaning. It was a melody composed from an unhealed heart, but no longer afraid. Then she found the song she'd written for her father years ago, one she'd never performed outside her own room. If you hadn't worked all night, I wouldn't have learned how to dream. If you hadn't stayed silent, I wouldn't have learned how to sing. She had once believed it should remain hers alone, a whisper no one needed to hear. But now she knew. The words never spoken are sometimes the very ones that must be heard. At the final open mic night of autumn, Lena stepped on stage as always, long coat, hair tied back, face calm. But this time, there was no trace of shyness. No downward glance. She sat, looked at the piano, then placed her hands on the keys. No introduction, no explanation, only music, warm, steady, like someone silently standing behind her through every childhood lesson. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sure. Each word carried a life within it. He never asked for thanks, but every note I play is his answer. He never said he was proud, but I heard it in the way he left the light on. The cafe held its breath, not in awe, but in reverence, sensing they were witnessing something private, beautiful, and real. Julian sat in the second row. No heavy coat tonight, no mask. He didn't cry, but his hand gripped his knee as if holding in something fragile, on the edge of breaking. Lena ended the song on a single, held note, not for flourish, but because she wasn't ready to let it go. When she stood to bow, the applause didn't come right away, as if everyone needed a second to return to the room. Julian rose slowly. He stepped toward the stage before she had moved from the piano. No one stopped him. No one questioned. He said nothing. Just placed a small folded note on the body of the piano, nodded to Lena, his eyes not sad, but deep with something, long buried and newly understood. Then he turned and left. Without looking back, Lena remained still. Her fingers shook gently as she opened the final note. Your father loved you in silence. Thank you for teaching me how to listen with my heart. No name. None needed. She folded the letter and placed it gently over her chest. 1 second. 2. Then she stood, stepped down from the stage, and disappeared into the hush of nameless guests under the golden lights of a fading autumn. That night, she didn't write. Didn't leave a letter. Didn't wait. Because she knew. Some stories don't need neat endings to become eternal. Some songs don't need to be finished to live on in the hearts of those who hear. And some people, passing quietly through our lives, leave behind light, like sunlight slipping through the leaves, soft, wordless, and never truly gone. Have you ever felt understood, through nothing more than a glance, a piece of music, or a silence that meant everything? If you have, leave a single dot. So. We know you're here with us quietly but deeply. Thank you for listening. The letters still to come, it will not just be words, but heartbeats written in music. Here's Shy Girl, scribbling hundreds of pages in a journal. Letters to a father whose face she's never seen. A young millionaire cancelling the biggest interview of his life, trembling on the edge of a train platform, paralyzed by panic. Downpour, a lost notebook, and 2 strangers colliding over the same wound being left behind no one knew. They shared the same blood. Rain poured down over Union Station that grey afternoon, drumming against the glass-domed ceiling in a steady, whispering rhythm. Stragglers hurried through the terminal, collars raised, eyes forward, dragging suitcases behind them. No one noticed the young man standing alone near the edge of Platform 3, trembling from something colder than the October air. Ethan Cole didn't look like the others. He carried no bags, checked no schedule, showed no concern for arrivals or departures. He simply stood there, shoulders slumped, hands buried deep in the soaked pockets of a dark trench coat. His gaze drifted toward the vanishing point of the tracks, where a red train light blinked in the thick curtain of rain. His heart pounded, part cold, part panic, the 3rd attack that week. The live interview he was supposed to do had been just an hour ago, a highly produced event, an audience waiting, cameras poised, but he'd walked off set before the lights even came on. No explanation, no return. Only the deafening thud of his heartbeat and an overwhelming urge to disappear. He didn't know why he'd come to the station, maybe because it was the one place in the city where no one needed a reason to linger. No one asked questions if you sat alone. No one looked twice. His footsteps echoed along the red brick corridor, past peeling walls, a stopped antique clock, the lingering scent of pastry from the cafe in the corner. Something about the place felt distant, familiar in the way old photographs do. He weaved past a few passengers seeking cover from the rain and found a wooden bench near the platform door. It was cold, empty, uninviting, perfect for vanishing. Rain dripped from his hair down the back of his neck as he sat, his hands, unsteady, clasped together. He tilted his head back, eyes closed, a breath pushing past his lips like a stifled cry, and then he saw it, a soft beige linen object tucked beside him on the bench, a notebook. Its fabric cover was crinkled from moisture but intact, fastened with a small wooden button and cord. No name, no markings. Something someone had left behind, a girl maybe, a traveler in a rush, or someone who had once sat here lost like him. He meant to set it aside, but something in him resisted, that strange instinct only the broken understand. He unlooped the cord. The pages were damp, edges curled, filled with neat flowing handwriting. He turned to the first page. I've always imagined my father as a good man. But if he isn't, do I still have the right to be angry with him? The words pierced through the armor Ethan had spent years constructing. His hands froze, his eyes lingered. There was something eerily familiar in the voice on the page, a quiet ache, a question only those who've waited in silence can bear to ask. He'd never kept a journal. But if he had, maybe he would have started the same way. Rain kept falling. Outside the fogged window, the train rolled away, its red light fading, but inside him something cracked, and all at once began to piece itself back together with every tender line he read. He turned another page. My mother says I look like him. but I've never seen his face. All I have is a description of a small tattoo behind his ear. A swallow. Every time I walk past a station, I search the crowd for men with a tattoo behind their ear. Ethan sat up, hand tightening around the notebook's spine. Like a lightning bolt through memory, an image struck. An old photo of his father, the man Ethan had only known through grainy snapshots, bending over a motorcycle, a small swallow inked behind his left ear. Cold sweat crept down his back, even as rain chilled the air. It couldn't be. He stared at the handwriting, read on. His heart thundered. In that instant the world receded. No trains, no rain, no murmurs of strangers. Only him, and the voice of a girl he didn't know, but who carried the same quiet loneliness he had buried for years. A girl who had waited for a father who never came, a man who had never dared face the truth, a notebook born of pain, and now opening memories neither of them knew they shared. Ethan couldn't explain what made him keep reading. Only that in that moment he no longer felt alone. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket, didn't write a word, just underlined the opening sentence. "No one should witness me like this," he whispered. And yet, maybe this very moment, this fragile, broken moment, had brought him to the truth he'd spent a lifetime running from. In the rain-soaked pages of the notebook, Lila's handwriting emerged like stitches sewn across the fragile skin of a heart. Her words made no attempt to impress or defend. They were simple, earnest, like the voice of a child who's never been heard, and Ethan read them line by line as if listening to an echo from a time he'd never touched. "I've been coming to this station since I was little. At first with my mother, when we used to meet my aunt's night train. But later I came alone. I always chose the wooden bench at the end. It creaked when I sat. My mom hated that sound, said it was broken, but I liked it. It reminded me of myself. Always there, even when no one noticed." Ethan pictured her, small, slight, rain-dark hair clinging to her neck, spine straight, wide eyes filled with too much hope. The pages painted the portrait of a child who had spent her entire youth imagining the face of someone she'd never met, a man called Father. One entry stood out, the ink darker, perhaps written on a day that meant more than the rest. "Today is my birthday. Mom made a small cake like she does every year, but this year I snuck it out with me, put it in a box from the bakery near the station. I waited for him from 3 o'clock. It started to rain at 3:42. The image took form in Ethan's mind, vivid as a memory. Little Lila, no more than 6, sitting beneath the sloped overhang of Union Station. The first winter rain misted down like thin smoke, seeping into the shoulders of her worn coat. In her lap, a white paper box. Inside it, a single cupcake with a crooked candle still lit against the breeze. Her head bowed, she sang softly to herself, "Happy birthday to me." No applause. No wishes. She glanced at the arrivals board, the letters flickering, lines shifting, but none of the names made her smile. She stopped singing, let out a quiet breath. A drop slid down her cheek, whether rain or a tear. No one could. Say her back in the present. Ethan's hands clutched the notebook tighter. He'd had birthdays alone, but he'd never imagined someone might be coming for him. Lila had. She imagined, then waited, then was disappointed, and imagined again, another passage. I always wondered if he was close by. Maybe he sat a few benches away. Maybe he stepped off a train, then left without turning back. Mom said he had a tattoo behind his left ear, a swallow. I always watched. Anyone with a tattoo there, I imagined he was the one. Ethan froze. That was the tattoo in the photograph. The old image of his father leaning over a motorbike, the small bird inked just behind his ear. It wasn't a common mark. And Lila, this girl he'd never known, had spent her childhood scanning crowds for it, holding on to the hope that one day it would lead her to him. He turned the page. The ink had changed tone, as if Lila had written it after a long silence. I used to think my father was a hero, like in storybooks. He wasn't here because he was doing something bigger, something brave. But then I began to wonder if he was good, Why didn't he come back? I don't hate him. I'm just tired. Tired of having to imagine the face of someone I don't know. Tired of pretending to forgive someone who never asked to be forgiven. Ethan couldn't read anymore, not because he didn't want to. Because something inside him was screaming. Lila's words were the ones he'd never let himself say. He too had once imagined his father was elsewhere for a noble reason. Until, like Lila, he understood the only truth that made sense. The man had simply chosen not to return. Her journal was a mirror, reflecting the sorrow Ethan had locked away for 30 years. He glanced around the station, as if she might be near. Maybe she still came here. Maybe she was somewhere now, writing a new page, unaware that a stranger was reading her past and finding his own in it. The slow hum of the PA system rolled through the station, stretching out the words of a delayed train, then fading again. Ethan rested the notebook on his lap, left it open. The wind carried in the smell of rain, of diesel from the tracks, of old memories. I think if I sit here long enough, he'll see me. The last line of the page pulsed in his mind like a dream that refused to dissolve. He had never imagined anyone could be so much like him. And now, he couldn't help but wonder. Would he have the courage to look her in the eyes? Or would he be just another man who walked past, never looking back? Ethan didn't leave Union Station that grey afternoon. Instead, he pulled the notebook from his coat pocket and began jotting down dates, locations, and the scattered details Lila had mentioned in her journal, each one now a thin thread stitching together two lives that once seemed to run parallel but unconnected. A small apartment in North Chicago, above an old bakery. Mom said he used to call her Peach. No one else ever did. He read that line over and over through the night. Somewhere in the fog of his memory, the word Peach carried a faint ring, like a sound once heard from a distance and long forgotten. When he was young, he'd sometimes wake to his mother whispering in her sleep, calling someone's name, half in love, half in grief. Peach, don't go. That hazy recollection now returned like a shard of glass pressed gently into his chest. The next morning, without telling anyone, Ethan drove to the old neighborhood in Chicago, where his mother had lived when she was young. He didn't plan it, didn't overthink. He simply went. As if something long avoided had finally risen to meet him. The bakery had changed its name, but not its shape. The upstairs balcony was still there, its wooden railing weathered silver. A few dried plants hung limply from rusted hooks. Ethan stood beneath it, gazing upward, as if watching a silent reel of someone else's life, flickering back into motion. He stepped inside. The new owner knew nothing of who had once lived above, but Ethan didn't need specifics. He only needed to breathe the air, catch the light, let the smell of yeast and rising dough wrap around him, and imagine the days his father had lived there. The days he left Ethan's mother behind to begin something new. That night, Ethan descended into his mother's basement and opened the old cedar trunk. She'd been gone for years, but she'd kept everything: letters, photographs, even postcards she never sent. He found a dusty leather-bound photo album and turned the pages slowly, his fingers gentle as if brushing against breath, and then, near the center, was the photo that hollowed the air in his lungs. His father, around 30, bent over a rusty bicycle. The afternoon sun caught his profile, and just behind his left ear, the tattoo of a small swallow, the same swallow Lila had described. The photo trembled in Ethan's hand. How did she know about that tattoo, if she never met him? The question escaped as a whisper, brittle and raw. He stared at the photo, then shut his eyes. That old fear returned, the one that said he didn't really know the man who gave him life, didn't know who he had loved, why he had left, how many unnamed wounds he had carved into children who had never once been called mine. Ethan turned back to Lila's words, retracing every clue. He brewed tea on a gas stove, never used an electric kettle. Mom said he liked the way the water sounded as it boiled, said it reminded him of a day beginning. Ethan remembered his mother saying that once in passing, as she stirred honey into a mug. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place with an almost eerie click. There was no doubt anymore. The man who abandoned Ethan was the same man Lila had spent years writing about, imagining, searching for, waiting on. And if what she wrote was real, then she wasn't a stranger. She was his sister. Ethan didn't cry. He just sat there, surrounded by the quiet ache of the old room, the photograph resting in his hands, his eyes fixed on a place that didn't exist anymore. Something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just the truth. It was how he saw his own childhood, not as a solitary shadow hiding in the corner, but as one of two children, in two different stations, waiting with the same broken hope. He placed the photo in his palm and folded a sheet of paper beside it. On it, he wrote the details he now knew to be true, as if preparing for something larger than himself. The night wind slipped through the window frame. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast a faint silhouette of his father on the wall, blurred but undeniable. No one could rewrite the past, but maybe, just maybe, Ethan was finding his way towards something else, not the truth, the connection that was never named. Aunt Margaret's apartment sat tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the west side of the city, where nothing ever seemed to change. The old maple trees still blushed orange and red each fall, and the worn grey stone steps still bore the familiar weight of Ethan's childhood feet. He hadn't visited in years, not out of avoidance exactly. Sometimes silence between two people felt kinder than questions. Neither dared to ask. Margaret was his mother's younger sister, the only woman in the family who'd stayed close, though always at a careful distance, as if proximity might stir the dust of old wounds best left undisturbed. When Ethan called, she didn't press him for a reason. She only said, "Come by this afternoon. The mint tea's still the same." When the wooden door opened, a familiar scent of cinnamon and old paper met him like a whispered memory. She looked unchanged, white hair pulled back, reading glasses perched low, a hand-knit sweater stretched soft over her frame, her eyes bright but tired. Ethan stepped in, shed his coat, and settled into the armchair across from her, hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "You've lost weight," she said, not as a scolding, but like noting a shift in weather. Ethan didn't answer. He let his eyes wander around the room, still filled with books, framed photographs, and the handcrafted pottery she'd collected over the years. Each object whispered a story. Afternoons spent baking, his mother knitting beside the radio, sunlight sifting through lace curtains. No one ever spoke of his father in those days, but his absence lingered everywhere, in every silence, every hesitating gesture his mother made. "You have something to ask," Margaret said, pouring a second cup. Ethan nodded. His fingers brushed the edge of the small notebook. Lila's journal, now something he carried like an extension of himself. "I read a diary," he began, "written by a girl. It has these very specific details. She describes a man with a swallow tattoo behind his ear. Says he lived in a little apartment in North Chicago. Called her mother Peach." Margaret said nothing. Her eyes softened, though her breath grew heavier. "I need to know, if it's possible." Ethan trailed off, as if saying, the words would make them irrevocably real. Margaret stood, walked slowly to the wooden cabinet in the corner, the one where she kept old keepsakes. She rifled through drawers until she found a pale blue tin box dented at one corner. Inside were bundles of letters, yellowed and bound with a ribbon gone nearly white. She opened the box, pulled out a single envelope, brittle with time. "This is from your mother," she said, offering it to him. She wrote it after he left, but never sent it. Ethan took it with trembling hands. It felt light, but the moment was heavy. He opened it carefully, as if the past itself might tear. His mother's handwriting unfurled on the page, slanted, gentle, like a voice speaking just above a whisper. "I'm not writing this to blame you. I'm writing because I don't want my heart to harden. Ethan's grown now. He's asked about you more than once. I only said he used to love me. Maybe it's true, maybe not. I can't tell anymore. But if you're reading this, then I want you to know I forgave you. Not because you deserved it, but because I don't want our son to grow up with bitterness." Ethan folded the letter back, his eyes stinging. Margaret didn't speak. She reached over and laid her hand gently on his. "You should know," she said softly. "Your mother forgave." But she never forgot. The tears came then, not in a rush, not in shudders, just quiet, steady drops, the kind that slip through when something long held finally releases. The grief of a boy who'd spent a lifetime pretending the wound. No longer hurt. The girl in the journal, Ethan said slowly, she might be his daughter. With someone else. Margaret nodded. Once he sent a photo. No note. Just a picture of a little girl, about your age when you started school. Your mother never spoke of it, but she kept it. In her desk drawer, Ethan exhaled, long and deep. One man, 2 children, raised in 2 cities, 2 homes, beneath the same quiet ache of absence. The afternoon passed like an old film, real. Sunlight shifting through curtains, the shadow of maple leaves dancing on the wall. Ethan sat in it all, surrounded by memory, by silence and a truth that was unfolding. Slow, tender, undeniable. He wasn't ready to meet Lila. Not yet, but he would be. First, he needed to know her, to listen, to carry her voice beside his own before he could speak the words she deserved to hear. And that journey began with his mother's letter, with forgiveness soft as morning mist. Union Station in the afternoon always wore a muted sadness, as if the building itself had learned to hold its breath for those who arrived bearing the weight of the past. Light filtered through the high glass dome, casting soft gold across the polished stone corridors, a glow that felt more like memory than hope. Ethan had returned, for the 3rd day in a row. No plan, no destination, just to sit, to watch. He chose the same bench where he'd first found the notebook. Each time he lowered himself onto the worn wood, he ran a hand along its splintering surface, tracing the small fractures like veins in time, lines that stretched from the girl he'd never met to the man he now struggled to understand. He didn't know what she looked like, but he was certain if he saw her he would know. The first day he simply sat, watched faces pass, each stride, each glance, each hand gripping a notebook or a phone. He tried not to expect anything. But whenever a young woman entered his line of vision, his heart misfired, slightly offbeat. The second day he brought the notebook, didn't read it, just held it, like an emotional compass. The third day, today, he began to feel something closer to waiting, no longer a vague search, a precise yearning, to see the one who had written those quiet, aching lines that mirrored his own. A young woman entered through the station's main doors, shoulder-length hair, beige coat, a linen-bound notebook in hand. Ethan's. Heart paused. He stood, crossed the floor quickly toward her. "Excuse me," he said, breath catching. She turned, her eyes clear, curious. Not her, not Lila, just another stranger carrying something that looked familiar. Ethan smiled, sheepish, and stepped back. Laughed quietly to himself, a soft, embarrassed sound. Then he stood still, watching her walk away, her footsteps folding into the crowd. Something about that moment left him feeling small, like a child searching for his father in a crowded supermarket, lost among 1,000 almosts. He returned to the bench, sat again. A breeze swept through the station, scattering loose papers from a nearby traveler. Ethan helped gather them, then bowed his head, eyes landing once more on the familiar cracks in the wood. "I've never wanted to meet a stranger this much," he whispered, not to be heard, just to admit it to himself. Train 217 was 17 minutes late. When the announcement came over the speaker, Ethan looked up without meaning to and saw her. She was seated at the far end of the bench. Still, quiet, like a figure in a watercolor painting. Her hair fell gently forward, a notebook in her lap, not to read, but to write. Her head was bowed, the curve of her back familiar in some unknowable way, and her hand moved slowly, steadily across the page. She didn't look around, didn't check her phone. She wrote, deliberate lines, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, he just watched. From a distance, he didn't want to disturb the quiet world she had made for herself. A gust lifted a few old newspapers. A yellow leaf fell to her feet. She didn't notice. Her eyes stayed on the page. Her pen never stopped, and perhaps that, more than anything, was what moved him. She didn't write to remember. She wrote to live. No one around noticed. No one knew that a kind of reunion was taking place. Unspoken, unnamed, but real. Ethan gripped the notebook in his lap. He didn't need confirmation. He knew this was her, the girl who'd written the first line that had stopped his world on a rainy afternoon. I've always imagined my father as a good man. But if he isn't, do I still have the right to be angry with him? The sentence returned to him now, like a melody threading everything that would come next. He didn't approach, not yet. Some connections must be formed from afar, in silence, as wounds begin to close from the inside out, needing no hand to touch them to know their healing. Ethan remained there until the girl stood, gathered her things and walked slowly from the station, unaware that someone had been writing his own story from the words she thought had long been forgotten. Ethan returned to Union Station every day after that, no longer searching with restless eyes, no longer catching his breath every time a familiar figure crossed his line of sight. He came the way one learns to carry pain, not with resistance, but with rhythm, quietly, steadily, as if it were a part of him now, something that no longer needed to be fixed, only lived with. He didn't try to see Lila anymore, but he always chose a bench far enough to watch. Some days she didn't come, others she arrived and left too quickly, but whenever she sat down and began to write, Ethan would quietly slip her old journal from his coat pocket, place it on his lap and read. The first time he read it, the pain in her words had gripped him like a wave, but now he read with a different kind of understanding. Each page no longer felt like the story of a stranger. It was a whisper from someone deeply known, bound by blood, yet raised in a parallel life that had never once crossed his. Lila wrote about hearing her mother cry at night, about the clatter of a spoon hitting the sink after a silent phone call, about the first time she'd heard someone call her mother Peach in a dream. Ethan too remembered the sound of his mother's sobs, muffled behind a closed door. He remembered the shape of absence, how it pressed in on every silence, every story left half told. Then he reached a line that made him stop and sit completely still. I used to wish I had a brother. Not because I wanted someone to play with, but because I needed someone who knew what this felt like. He froze, read slower. Each word pierced the long-held quiet he'd mistaken for healing. If I had someone like that, I wouldn't feel so crazy for imagining every man could be my father. I wouldn't have to keep all these dreams to myself, like letters that never get delivered. Ethan closed the journal, held it to his chest, as though he were holding a part of her heart. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever, but he also knew this moment wasn't meant for truth, not yet. Even if it was a beautiful one, some truths have to be swallowed whole, quietly digested, before they're ready to be spoken. One afternoon, sitting in his usual spot, Ethan looked up just as Lila lifted her eyes from the page. For a breath, a blink, their gazes met. A second, maybe less, but it was enough. Enough for Ethan to see something familiar in her expression, a reflection, a thread. She furrowed her brow, then quickly dropped her gaze, returning to her writing. Maybe she hadn't noticed. Maybe he was just another man sitting nearby, a stranger passing through. But Ethan knew that moment, brief as it was, confirmed what he had long felt. This wasn't just a stranger writing about the same wound. This was family. This was the echo of a soul he hadn't known he'd lost. That night, Ethan returned home and set the journal on the table. He took a small sheet of paper, sat with it for a long time before putting pen to it. No name, no introduction. Just a single line carefully written, as if even the ink might tremble. If you knew I was listening, would you keep writing? He folded the note and tucked it into the journal, right at the page where she'd written about the brother she wished. She'd had not a confession, not a revelation, just a way to say, I'm here. And I understand. Tomorrow he would return the notebook, Not because it was time to tell her everything, but because it was time for Lila to know she had never truly been writing into silence. And maybe, for the first time, her words would find their way home. That afternoon the sky held its peace. The air around Union Station softened, as if even the weather understood that today called for stillness. No thunder murmured from the distance. No rain clattered against the glass dome. Only pale sunlight streamed through the high-arched windows, gilding the dust on the old wooden benches with a quiet gold. Ethan stood 10 steps away from her. He had been there for some time, holding the journal wrapped carefully in his hands, the folded note inside like a sliver of his heart set apart, waiting to be returned to its rightful keeper. Lila sat on the familiar bench, writing as she always did. She wore headphones, her head bowed in concentration. The light caught her hair just right, casting a warm, honeyed glow over the loose strands falling across her brow. Ethan stepped forward, softly, slowly. He didn't want to shatter the fragile world she had created for herself. But the journal pulsed in his grip, and inside him, something burned loud and wordless. He came to stand just behind her. He bent slightly, hand hovering over the journal, about to place it beside her. Then, almost instinctively, his other hand lifted, reaching for her shoulder, to let her know, to say in touch alone that someone had read her, truly read her, that someone had carried her pain like it was their own. But he stopped, mid-air, his hand paused, as if pulled back by the invisible thread of fear, of reverence, of knowing that some silences are not meant to be broken by touch. Not? No, not like this. He lowered his hand gently and placed the journal beside her, drew out the note, set it on top. The paper was white, unadorned, holding just a single line in slanted, careful handwriting. If you knew I was listening, would you keep writing? No name, no explanation, only a question, just enough for one soul to feel the presence of another. Ethan stepped back. He stood for a moment longer, watching Lila, this girl who might be his sister, who might be a missing chapter of his childhood, still writing, still shaping the unfinished pieces of her life. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. When Lila finally lifted her head, the soft hum of piano music still played in her ears from the same worn playlist she always listened to when she wrote. Her gaze fell to the notebook beside her. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it. She looked around, no one. Her fingers touched the fabric cover. She opened it. Her heart caught. It was her journal, the one she thought she'd lost. The same pages, the same familiar lines, and there under the first sentence a single mark, a line of ink that wasn't hers. She turned the pages. In the center, where she had once written about the brother she'd only wished into being, was a folded slip of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The ink warm. Tilted slightly right, strong but tender. If you knew I was listening, would you keep writing? She didn't understand, not right away. But something in her eyes shifted. A quiet smile rose, brief and unreadable. Grief, or gratitude, or maybe wonder. All she knew was that something inside her, some echoing hollow, had just been gently filled. Some people come not to change us, but to witness. No names, no speeches, just the right question at the right moment. And then they leave, as if their presence only ever needed to be that. One small breath, enough to move someone's life ever so slightly forward. Lila stayed on the old wooden bench longer than usual. Union Station seemed brighter that day, not because of the sunlight outside, but because of something gentler spreading from within her, like the feeling after a long rain, when the sea. Streets are still slick, but people begin to walk without fear of slipping. She read the note again. If you knew I was listening, would you keep writing? A simple line, unsigned. But there was something in the way the words tilted slightly, the space between each line, something that felt like a whisper from someone who had been listening for a long time. Not interrupting, not intruding, just listening. She let out a soft breath. Her fingers brushed the fabric cover of the journal as if touching something sacred. Someone had read not just her words, but the spaces between them. The quiet she had tucked away where no one could see. She pulled out her pen. A fresh page, the paper still slightly warped from dampness, but blank and waiting. The first line flowed out like water freed from a dam. I no longer wait for my father. But maybe. I'll wait for someone willing to listen. Her hand paused, then moved again. I don't know who you are yet, but I know you understand. I don't need someone to fix the past for me, only someone to tell me that what I felt was real. She wrote for the first time, not to fill a void or chase a missing piece, but to open something new. It wasn't the same old ache, bleeding through pages like an unhealed wound. It was something strange, tender, the feeling of waking after a long dream and realizing that morning had finally come. A tear fell onto the page. Not rain, not sorrow, relief. She wiped it away and kept writing. If I keep writing, will you still be there listening? No answer came, only the faint call of the station's PA system, announcing the departure of a distant train. Lila smiled softly, as if she already knew the answer. A while later, she stood. She didn't know if the stranger would ever return, but it no longer mattered the way it once had. She had written words she never thought she could, and someone had heard them, enough to crack open a heart that had been closed for too long. She placed her hand on the journal and closed it gently, no longer wrapping it tightly with its old cord, no longer hiding it under her pillow like a shameful secret. She would keep writing, not because she needed to be heard, but because now she knew her voice was worthy of being spoken aloud. In the distance, a man passed down the corridor of the station. He didn't look her way. She didn't look his. They didn't need to meet each other's eyes, because sometimes the most important things are already said, in the quietest ways. Lila stepped out of the station, her stride lighter, her gaze no longer searching but looking straight ahead. In her hand, the journal, no longer a vault of old wounds but a place for beginnings. And inside her, not a desperate plea of "please hear me," but a gentle invitation. I'm still writing. If you're still listening up here, I'm here. If you discovered that the one who wrote that journal might be the sister you never knew you had, what would you do? Would you tell her the truth, or stay silent to protect the fragile peace she's found? Share your thoughts, because this story is only just beginning.